On his first day in office, President Donald Trump approved of a large number of executive orders. One of them included the overturning of a previous regulation that said that immigration enforcement agents cannot conduct raids or arrests at schools, places of worship, healthcare facilities, or social service agencies. On January 23, 2025, only a few days after President Trump's inauguration, Bishop Mark Seitz, the Bishop of El Paso, Texas, and the chairman of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Migration, and Sister Mary Haddad, the president and CEO of the Catholic Health Association of the United States, and Carrie Alice Robinson, the president and CEO of Catholic Charities USA, issued a statement that was published on the website of the USCCB. In this statement, it asserted that the Church's charitable and humanitarian work is oriented towards the end of upholding the dignity of every human being. It further stated that since the dignity of every human does not depend on our immigration status or national origin, the Church sees itself as having the duty to uphold the dignity of all people, even non-citizens. As a result, the Church concluded that, while nations have a duty to ensure secure borders, it has no right to ensure national security at the border in a way that undermines the dignity of the individual. Thus, the document goes on to state, quote, "We recognize the need for just immigration enforcement and affirm the government's obligation to carry it out in a targeted, proportional, and humane way. However, non-emergency immigration enforcement in schools, places of worship, social service agencies, healthcare facilities, or other sensitive settings where people receive essential services would be contrary to the common good." Unquote. On January 26, 3 days after the publication of this document, Vice President J.D. Vance, in an interview with Face the Nation, was asked about his response to this. This is a particular potent question, not only because of the broader social influence of the Church, but because Vice President Vance is himself a Catholic. Vance describes himself as being quote-unquote heartbroken by the statement, asserting that since the USCCB received over $100 million to help immigrants, that it may be more concerned about maintaining its money flow than actually standing up for social justice, humanitarianism, and immigration reform. This can be seen, President Vance said, in the USCCB's supposed lack of response to illegal immigrants committing violent crimes. Those who wrote the original document were concerned about immigration agents responding to non-emergency immigrant enforcement, that is, the arrest of immigrants not committing violent crimes, and particularly in a way that prevents them from accessing essential services, including within the context of attending church services. Further, a statement from the USCCB put out in response to Vice President Vance's words asserts that the USCCB has been involved in a partnership with the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, USRAP, since the early 1980s to help relocate refugees. And yet the USCCB does not help with the resettling of refugees unless they are first vetted by the proper federal agencies. And thus they wouldn't let in people who have been proven to be violent criminals. The USCCB further asserted that the amount of money that they make to help immigrants is just enough to help keep the program going, that they don't profit off of the helping of migrants and refugees. When confronted specifically with the issue of whether it was permissible for immigration officers to conduct arrests or raids in places of worship or schools, Vice President Vance sort of beat around the bush, noting that President Trump was merely trying to uphold his campaign promises to tighten the border and pointing out that he was concerned primarily with national security and the arrest of violent criminals who cross our borders. While the Catholic Church has upheld the duty of nations to secure their borders, and the duty of immigrants to follow all of the laws of the nation they seek entry into, and while I would not deny Vice President Vance's sincerity in his Catholic faith, I would assert that there is a fundamental problem with Vice President Vance's response, one that showcases an unsound view on the limits of the state's authority with respect to the Church. Vice President Vance noted how law enforcement should always attempt to remove violent criminals from schools, places of worship, or other similar situations. Yet, that's not what the USCCB was responding to. As stated previously, the USCCB was responding to the conducting of raids or arrests in quote unquote non emergency situations. Is Vice President Vance, across the board, okay with immigration officials entering into a church during the celebration of the holy sacrifice of the Mass in order to arrest an illegal immigrant not taking part in violent crimes? While this may, to some extent, be a simplification of what Vice President Vance is saying, it does raise an important issue. How far can the state get involved in the inner life of the church? How much can it disrupt the church conducting its mission in order to get the job done, so to speak? The broad parameters of the Catholic understanding of church state relations, traditionally, is rooted in the notion that politics presupposes morality. The concept of justice is a fundamentally moral claim, and this makes sense. Society refers to the sum total of all relations that exist between individuals living in a specific place at a specific point in time. How we treat one another is a fundamentally moral issue. Yet there are two levels of interpersonal interaction. The first is how we treat people in our immediate surroundings. The second is how we interact with people in the larger community. The way society is organized, together with the more general institutions that make up society, are meant to promote specific sets of social relations. That is, specific ways in which members of a community interact with other members of the community in a way that is just and therefore moral. You see, justice is the virtue whereby people maintain rightly ordered relations with one another. The virtue of justice, like all other virtues, exists primarily in individuals. Yet ways of structuring society or specific types of social relations are just insofar as they reinforced just manners in which individual members of society interact with other members of society. Laws are rules meant to reinforce these just social relations, and governments are established to create, enforce, and interpret these laws. Because of the fundamentally moral or ethical nature of justice, an authentic understanding of the nature of justice, together with authentically just laws and authentically just ways of organizing society, must by definition be rooted in an accurate understanding of morality. And since the Church contains the fullest expression of moral truth, all laws should be in conformity with the teachings of Jesus and His Church, and all leaders in the political realm should be Christian. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that all non Christian leaders are automatically invalid. Yet, there are two things to consider. Firstly, non Christian leaders are legitimate only insofar as what they say conforms to natural understandings of justice, and insofar as they don't persecute the church. Secondly, in majority Christian societies, the citizens should always seek Christian leaders, and prefer Christian leaders to non Christian leaders, for if the former have orthodox understandings of church teaching, they have a fuller, more complete understanding of justice than their non Christian counterparts. With this in mind, the Catholic Church has traditionally understood that there should be a close relationship between the Church and the state. While most of the theologians in the Catholic tradition rejected the notion of a state sponsored church, take, for instance, the model of church state relations found in England, the Catholic Church, even in many of her magisterial documents, asserted that the Church should occupy a special place in society, and that the Catholic Church, being the one true church founded by Jesus Christ, who is God in human form, has certain rights and privileges that even other religions, even other branches of Christianity don't have, and it is the duty of the state to recognize and honor this. Further, the state is extremely limited in terms of how much involvement it can or should have in church affairs. It cannot, for instance, limit the rights of the church to perpetuate itself. It cannot do anything to cut off communication between the faithful and the clergy, or between the clergy and their superiors. It cannot suppress the existence of Catholic schools. It cannot prevent members of the clergy from assuming their office apart from state approval. Further, the state cannot act as if it is the source of the church's rights and privileges. Now, the church has a duty to proclaim the gospel to all people, especially in today's world, where the culture is becoming more and more out of step with official church teaching and the general message of the gospel. Society, and even the state, is heading down a moral rabbit hole that can't but undermine its own foundations. This is something that's been emphasized throughout the modern era, and in particular over the course of the 20th century, during which time the moral decline of society has been shifted into overdrive. In particular, the notion that the church needs to proclaim the gospel anew, that is, with increased levels of clarity and effectiveness in the modern era, is something that's been strongly emphasized since the time of the Second Vatican Council, with the concept of the new evangelization. The moral implications of the gospel permeate every aspect of life, including our life in society. This has expressed itself in the Church's dedication to humanitarian or philanthropic concerns. But the all pervasive character of Jesus's or the Church's moral teachings have also expressed themselves in more explicitly political terms. For instance, the fact that some in the Church have felt motivated by the teachings of the Church to take part in activism in favor of certain political causes that they see as helping to create a more just, a more Christ like society. This has also expressed itself on an institutional level. Since the Church has, for several centuries, practiced immense cultural and political influence, it has seen itself as having the duty to keep the state in check. Historically, this has taken the form of speaking out and even applying pressure where necessary when the state passes unjust laws or takes part in unjust actions. And, if this doesn't work, to directly take part in or oversee broader measures to directly subvert such unjust actions from the state. Such dynamics in the relationship between the church and the state were seen as justifiable because, while all earthly authority comes from God, the authority of the church is more fundamental than that of the state. The relationship between the church and the state, to be extraordinarily simplistic, can thus be defined in the following terms. While the church and the state are two distinct institutions, with two distinct realms of authority, there should, for the sake of maintaining social justice, be a close relationship between the two, with the church being in charge. Now, I know that this story is somewhat dated, given the nature of the 24-hour news cycle. Yet I think that there's an important series of theological, moral, and sociological issues at play beyond merely, oh my gosh, look at this Catholic politician butting heads with the church. Unfortunately, one of the defining features of modernity, including the classical liberalism that has defined most of American political philosophy, is the notion of the radical autonomy of the state. The state has its own agenda, its own set of goals, and no one outside of the political realm has the right to dictate what the state can and cannot do. Issues of what the state can or should do is solely a political issue between the state and its citizens. To some degree, the rise of such a mindset can be described in terms of the notion of the separation of church and state, and issues that some early modern thinkers had with the concept of a state sponsored church or theocracy. Nonetheless, it is also influenced by a broader trend that goes beyond even the rise of the Enlightenment. During the medieval period, most nations were much more decentralized in their structure, and most high ranking political leaders, kings, emperors, high level nobles, etc., had very little involvement in the day to day life of local jurisdictions. Over the course of the modern period, as these higher levels of government began to become more centralized, there came the desire to reduce the influence of any social institution with large amounts of authority that was seen as paralleling the state. One such example of an institution that was seen as paralleling the state and that could subvert the state's agenda if it so willed, and was thus seen as competing with the state for loyalty, was the church. Attempts were thus made to subvert the authority of the church to that of the state. Of course, in that process, the one thorn in the side of many secular political leaders was the Catholic Church. Unlike Protestantism, with its decentralized ecclesial structures that made them more subject to intervention or influence from the state, the Catholic Church had a much more highly centralized ecclesiastical structure whose highest ranking leader, the Pope, was seen as having vast amounts of both spiritual and political authority, and who practiced immense amounts of spiritual, moral, and social influence among millions, in today's world, a little over 1 billion people across national borders, an influence that it could wield even when it wasn't acting in a strictly political sense. The clergy of the Catholic Church were directly answerable to their superiors, and the highest ranking clergy were answerable directly to the Pope. The Catholic Church butts heads with the state more than any other religion in the West, and was harder to control than most other religions. There was therefore a strong tendency in Enlightenment thought to emphasize the voluntary nature of religion, and the abhorrent nature of forced conversions. All of this was something that it should have done, and in fact has precedent in church teaching itself. Unfortunately, this tendency to emphasize religious freedom and fight against theocracy or state sponsored churches led to modernity's tendency to affirm the autonomy of the state over and against the authority of the church, and to completely push out the church's influence in the public realm, at least in any formal institutional sense. Long gone are the days in which the church and the state were parallel but equally influential forces in society, which defines the medieval model. The modern ethos, on some level, sees the state, our cultural identity, our nationality or our ethnic heritage, our cultural values, as the grand unifying factor in society, and desires that the church be subordinate to that. Apart from the perennial questions of how to evangelize or Christianize pluralistic societies, which in many ways is the defining question of our time, one has to look at another element of this question that is often overlooked, namely, cultural and political pressures to subordinate the influence of the church to that of the state or the culture. The church is to be a purely personal, private, devotional phenomena, and is not to shake the boat too much, lest it butt heads with the state. The state, for instance, would have a duty to enter into a church and possibly even disrupt a church service in order to stop a violent criminal present in a church. Nonetheless, the notion that police, or law enforcement, or immigration enforcement agents have a right to enter into a church in order to remove a non-violent criminal, in this case an illegal immigrant, shows that the state is seen as what the church once was, as an all-encompassing, ever-present social force that has the right to intervene itself in everything and anything, as all other social institutions are subordinate to it. The sacred is irrelevant to the social health of society in such a worldview, and is at best an obstacle to the agenda of the state. In a word, the modern American understanding of the state, as much as it is committed to the ideal of freedom, is still a product of the modern understanding of the state and its relation to the church, with all the baggage that this entails. The state sees itself as the ultimate unifying factor of society. All else in society must be subject to it. An institution like the church claims to have an authority more fundamental than that of the state, and demands a greater loyalty. And when one is talking about a religion like Roman Catholicism, one is talking about a religion with a highly centralized and easily identifiable hierarchical structure with a singular leader at the top who practices an immense amount of spiritual authority. if not also political authority, that cuts across national boundaries, thereby making the Catholic Church much more difficult to control or eradicate. Church, and religion more generally, is therefore something parallel to the state, something that cannot be absorbed into the state, thereby making it a threat to the state's monopoly of power. Most American conservatives are thus not truly conservative in the historical or traditional sense. They are, in a word, the more conservative branch of classical liberalism. As such, they are just as much products of modernity as the liberals of our time, rather than defenders of tradition. An American conservative therefore sees religion as playing an important role in social cohesion and moral formation. But heaven forbid the church intrude on the realm of the state. Opposition to the state forcing church affiliated organizations to provide contraception as a part of their insurance plans or force Christian bakers to cater same sex marriages is, for conservatives, born more out of a commitment to the First Amendment and the underlying political philosophy it embodies, or a commitment to the libertarianism of contemporary conservatism rather than to the unique rights and authority of Christ's church. Yet, an even more important issue emerging from this is what we see as the role of the church in society. Conservatives are all for having the church play an integral role in society, politics, or the broader culture. Yet conservatives must take part in some serious self reflection. Do they support the church playing a role in society only insofar as the church serves to uphold the vision of society that they support? I think the answer for most conservatives, at least implicitly, is unfortunately yes. In some sense, it is a more subtle form of the same issue that liberals face. The sorts of hot button issues of the day that Catholics are concerned about tend to be the same as the sorts of issues that conservatives see as problematic, and thus there is a lot of alliance between conservatives and Catholics on issues like preserving the traditional family unit or traditional marriage, fighting against abortion, resisting secularism, counteracting radical gender theory, or feminism, or other similar issues. This leads to the blanket assumption that Catholic social thought is basically just conservatism with religious window dressing, or that conservatism represents a truly consistent application of what the Church believes. But if there ever comes a time when conservatives take issue with something said by the Church, the first instinct of a lot of conservatives, like a lot of liberal counterparts, is to throw the Church under the bus, to speak about how the Church, to use the words of Vice President Vance, is not a good ally in bringing about what he sees as the politically best vision of society. The broad parameters of the modern understanding of the relationship between the Church and the state can be seen in Thomas Hobbes's work, The Leviathan. He writes, quote, "But in those places where the priesthood took that office, though many other doctrines of the Church of Rome were forbidden to be taught, yet this doctrine, that the kingdom of Christ is already come, and that it began at the resurrection of our Savior, was still retained. What profit do they expect from it? The same which the popes expected, to have a sovereign power over the people. For what is it for men to excommunicate their lawful king, but to keep him for all places of God's public service in his own kingdom, and with force to resist him, when he with force endeavoureth to correct them? Or what is it, without authority from the civil sovereign, to excommunicate any person, but to take from him his lawful liberty, that is, to usurp an unlawful power over their brethren? The authors, therefore, of this darkness in religion are the Roman and the priestly clergy. All other bishops in that commonwealth soever have not their rights neither immediately from God, nor mediately from their civil sovereigns, to be in every Christian commonwealth may potent them, for so are bishops that have their dependence on the Pope, and owe obedience to him, though he be a foreign prince, by which means he is able, as he hath done many times, to raise a civil war against the state that submits not itself to be governed according to his pleasure and interest. Unquote. He then goes on to say, quote, but the emperors and other Christian sovereigns, under whose government these errors and like encroachments of ecclesiastics upon their office had first crept in, to the disturbance of their possessions and of the tranquillity of their subjects, though they suffered the same for want of foresight of the sequel, and of insight into the designs of their teachers, may nevertheless be esteemed accessories to their own and the public damage. For without their authority, there could at first no seditious doctrine have been publicly preached. I say they might have hindered the same in the beginning, but when the people were once possessed by those spiritual men, there was no humane remedy to be applied, that any man could invent, and for the remedies that God should provide, who never faileth in his good time to destroy all the machinations of men against the truth, we are to attend to his good pleasure, that suffereth many times the prosperity of his enemies, together with their ambition, to grow to such a height, as the violence thereof openeth the eyes, which the wariness of their predecessors had sealed up, and makes men by too much grasping let go all, as Peter's net was broken by the struggling of too great a multitude of fishes, whereas the impatience of those that strive to resist such encroachments before their subjects' eyes were opened, but did increase the power they resisted. But as the inventions of men are woven, so also are they raveled out. The way is the same, but the order is inverted. The web begins at first elements of power, which are wisdom, humility, sincerity, and other virtues of the apostles, whom the people converted, obeyed out of reverence, not by obligation. Their consciences were free, and their words and actions subject to none but the civil power. Unquote. For Hobbes, the state is the ultimate source of unity and cohesion within society. With the rise of Christianity, and even as Christianity began to be corrupted by what he, as a Protestant, would have seen as the errors of Catholicism, the notion of the kingdom of God persisted. The reason why this notion continued even in the midst of the corruption of Christianity by the papacy was because this notion was manipulated to justify the notion that the Pope, as the chief authority in the Church and as Christ's representative on earth, had a certain political authority above that of the states, and therefore the rights to intervene in matters of the states. All of this leads to the notion that the local clergy derive their authority not directly from God, nor from God mediated by the state, but directly from the Pope. And since the Pope is a foreign leader with a certain level of political authority, the clergy, who owe their ultimate loyalty to the Pope, can never be completely and entirely loyal to the state, but can only be loyal to the state insofar as such loyalties do not violate their loyalty to the Pope. Pope's political authority is seen as more fundamental than that of the state, and thus the Pope has vast powers in speaking out against the state or individual leaders, but they in turn have a much more limited power in speaking out against the Pope. The Pope could excommunicate people in any nation, thereby depriving them of certain rights and privileges, which in turn threatens the authority of the state, who was the chief authority meant to protect the rights of its citizens or to deprive them of rights as a punishment for certain crimes. The state was limited in fighting against the preaching of certain doctrines that went against the interest of the state or society at large. Yet with the rise of the Reformation and the throwing off of papal authority, the consciences of the citizens and of local clergy were now no longer subject to any other earthly authority other than the states. And this is how Hobbes believed that it should be. He believed that the conceptualization of the church as an institution not only parallel to that of the state, but with a level of authority rivaling that of the state, created divided allegiances that threatened the unity and stability of society. Thus, while Hobbes believed that religion played an important and positive role in society, the authority of religion, including the church, should never be practiced in a way that threatens the good of society as a whole or the interests of the state in specific. It is for this reason that Hobbes wouldn't have supported the notion that the church, in some sense, is outside of the state and serves to keep the state in check, rather supporting the British view that the church should be a state sponsored institution. That is to say, there should be a close relationship between the church and the state, with the state in charge. Such a vision of church state relations created the broad context for its own demise. The notion that the church is subordinate to the state led to secularization, that is, attempts on the part of the state to reduce or even eliminate the influence of the church in the state, and in the public square more generally. Secular society, in the modern era, in a word, has an attitude towards the church of help or get out of the way. It sees itself as subordinate to nothing and to nobody, let alone something outside of the secular realm. American Catholics are thus at a crossroads. How do we conceptualize the role of the church in society? Do we envision the role of the church in a way that aligns with the objective truths surrounding the nature and mission of the church as determined by our Lord? Or do we, on the other hand, envision the role of the church in a way that either implicitly or explicitly either makes the church subordinate to the state or makes the church irrelevant to any political or social affairs, that makes the church a slave to the agenda or interests of the state? If Catholics choose the former, and all practicing faithful Catholics loyal to the teachings of Scripture and the Church should choose the former, they must liberate themselves not only from liberalism, but also from most forms of American conservatism. Liberals have fully embraced the ethos of modernity. Conservatives, on the other hand, while opposing liberalism on certain specific issues, are still the products of modernity just as much as their liberal counterparts. With all of the anti Catholic and more general anti Christian and secularist baggage this includes. They just happen to represent the branch of modernity that is most compatible with, or more specifically, least opposed to, Christianity and religion. The Catholic can therefore either be a consistent Catholic, but an inconsistent liberal and an inconsistent conservative, or they can be a consistent conservative and a consistent liberal, but an inconsistent Catholic. You can't have both. And so, now is the time for a choice.